Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for being here this evening. And I'm sitting comfortably, and I hope you're doing the same. By the way, I learned to do this in Russia, where it is the common practice. But I also do it because I'm old. We're going to talk about this whole question of cosmic chemistry, as we've called it. Does science mix with faith in God and Christianity? Because there is a very widespread impression in our culture in the West that you cannot really be a credibly rational person, scientifically literate, and believe in God. Even less can you be such a person and believe in Christianity. And the reason for that tension within the culture is very clear, because some very prominent voices are urging atheism. Richard Dawkins is perhaps still the best known, but Stephen Hawking is perhaps, the late Stephen Hawking, the most able. I remember Stephen at Cambridge. He was just ahead of me in terms of chronology, and he's light years ahead of me in his genius as a mathematician, an applied mathematician. And of course, people sat up when Stephen made the pronouncement some time ago in the Times front page: God did not create the universe. And he's had a huge influence on the public. Now, nothing I'm going to say tonight is in any way intended to criticize his genius as a mathematician. But he moved outside mathematics into philosophy. And I'm doing the same tonight, so I need to take my own advice. It's quite dangerous when you shift into another field which is not part of your professional expertise. We all have to do it, of course. Everybody does it. The important thing is to check the details much more carefully in topics where you're not necessarily an expert. And Hawking said, one cannot prove that God doesn't exist, but science makes God unnecessary. The laws of physics can explain the universe without the need for a creator. And so with a co-author, he wrote a book called The Grand Design. The title is fascinating. When I saw it coming out, Hawking writing about the grand design, even though he's an atheist. He perceives design. In fact, everybody does. Richard Dawkins does. He says it's terribly, terribly tempting to think that what we see in biology is designed. But then he attempts to explain it away as only apparently designed. So I was fascinated to read this book, and even more fascinated when I discovered what its objective was. Hawking at the beginning starts by saying there are big questions that we all ask. How can we understand the universe in which we find ourselves? What is the nature of reality? Where did it all come from? Does the universe need a creator? And I thought this is going to be really interesting, until I read the next sentence, which goes like this. Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. It has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly in physics. As a result, scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge. Now, notice what that's claiming. This is a very widespread view today, that in the end, science, that is the natural sciences, are the only way to truth. That view we call scientism. And it ends up by teaching essentially that science is coextensive with rationality, so that anything beyond science is not even rational. Now, that is Hawking's view, but it's not the view of people who achieved even greater scientific distinction than he did. And I want to quote the late Sir Peter Medawar, who won the Nobel Prize for for chemistry. That there is indeed a limit upon science is made very clear by the existence of questions that science cannot answer, and that no conceivable advance of science would empower it to answer. These are the questions that children ask, the ultimate questions of Karl Popper, such questions as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living? Now that's perceptive, because it's telling us that even a child can ask questions that science cannot, even in principle, answer. But they're not irrational questions. They're perfectly rational questions. And you see, if the natural sciences could answer all our questions, we'd have to shut half the faculties in Birmingham University tomorrow. There'd be no arts, there'd be no history, there'd be no linguistics, there'd be no philosophy, there'd be no languages, there'd be no literature. It is absurd to suggest that science is the only way to truth. And indeed, because I love logic, it's a bit late at night for logic, isn't it? But nevertheless, the statement, science is the only way to truth, is illogical, because that statement is not a statement of science. So if it's true, it's false. Have you got that? Good. You're obviously all very much awake. These are what we call logically incoherent statements. The notion that science is the only way to truth, which Hawking and Dawkins and many others espouse and push in our society, is logically incoherent on the one hand, and it's demonstrably false. Now, how do we approach questions like this? There are many approaches, but in my experience, history is one of the good places to start. As we look at the rise of what we might call modern science in the 16th and 17th centuries, and we think of people like Galileo and Kepler and Newton and coming up to Clerk Maxwell and so on. The fascinating thing about all of these pioneers, and geniuses they were, is that they all believed in God. And that has become the focus of a great deal of study. The question's obvious. Is there any connection between their faith in God as creator and the science that they did? That the connection was deep is shown by the words that still stand on the door of the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, one of the most famous physics labs in the world. On that door are written these words: "Great are the works of the Lord, to be studied by all who take delight in them." And C.S. Lewis, who's had a huge influence on me, so I love the arts as much as I love the sciences, but C.S. Lewis understood a lot about the philosophy of science, and in one of his books, he talks about Alfred North Whitehead, who is a very famous philosopher and historian of science. And this is a quote from Lewis. Professor Whitehead points out that centuries of belief in a God who combined the personal energy of Jehovah with the rationality of a Greek philosopher first produced that firm expectation of systematic order which rendered possible the birth of modern science. Men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a legislator. And to quote the eminent American philosopher Alvin Plantinga, the alleged conflict between science and theism is actually superficial. You see, faith in God as creator, the rational mind behind the universe, far from hindering Galileo and Kepler and Newton and so on, far from hindering their science, it was the motor that drove it. And we've moved away from that. And that's the thing that strikes me as so odd. Think of Hawking. The chair he held at Cambridge was the same chair that Isaac Newton held. And yet Newton believed in God. And Hawking doesn't. It gets even more interesting when you think about some of the things they studied. Newton gave us the law of gravitation. Hawking studied gravity and black holes and so on. Even more than that, Newton used gravity as a reason for believing in God. He came across this wonderful formulation, and as he looked at the universe, to paraphrase his reaction, it was, what a genius of a God who does it that way. And that, of course, is my reaction to mathematical discoveries. When we discover the intricate way in which the universe behaves, I increase in my admiration for the God who designed it, just as the more you understand of art, the more you can admire the genius of a Bruegel or a Rembrandt or a Picasso. The more you understand of engineering, the more you can admire the intricacy of a Rolls-Royce engine. Not the less. It's more understanding, not less understanding, gives rise to a greater appreciation for the intelligence that goes into the creation of these things. And yet, Newton believes in God, but Hawking uses gravity as a reason not to believe in God. And that was an intriguing circumstance that drove me actually to write a little book called God and Stephen Hawking, Whose Design Is It Anyway? But let's step back from this. What is driving this? You see, here are two things. There's the natural sciences, mathematics, physics, and so on. And then there are these worldviews. Atheism and Christianity are the two main ones we'll consider tonight. There are a few others, but these are the main ones. So which comes first and which comes second? That's a very important question, because I want to argue, and in one sense it's my first main point tonight, is that the conflict isn't between science and belief in God at all. There is a conflict, but it's not there. Let me illustrate it very simply by mentioning two Nobel Prize winners. One you've probably heard of, Steven Weinberg, who's an atheist. Another you haven't heard of, possibly, and he's E.T.S. Walton. And I mention him because he's the only Irish Nobel Prize winner for physics. He actually helped Cockcroft split the atom in Cambridge, so he earned his Nobel Prize. Now, think of those two men. Right at the top of physics, they both won the Nobel Prize. So physics doesn't divide them. What does divide them? Well, Weinberg is a noted atheist, and Walton is a noted Christian, or was. So what divides them is worldview, not science. And what I want to suggest to you is it's very important in trying to navigate the current debate to realize where the tension lies. It's not science versus God or Christianity. It's the worldviews of theism, Christianity, versus atheism. And there are scientists on both sides. You may not know, but at least according to Wikipedia, in the 100 years between 1900 and 2000, over 65% of Nobel Prize winners believed in God. So we've placed the problem in the wrong place. And therefore the question to ask, as far as I'm concerned, is, does science necessarily lead to atheism? Or does it lead to belief in God? Or does it lead nowhere? Where does it actually stand? Now, some scientists have been very honest in telling us that their science doesn't make them atheists. It's their atheism that starts the whole process going. For instance, George Klein, Nobel Prize winner. I am not an agnostic. I am an atheist. My attitude is not based on science, but rather on faith. The absence of a creator, the non-existence of God is my childhood faith, my adult belief, unshakable and holy. Now, that's extremely honest, and there have been other very honest people saying a similar thing. In other words, they start with their atheism. It's not a deduction from their science. It's what they bring to bear on their science. Now, all of us, of course, wear glasses as we look at the world. I wear theistic Christian glasses as I look at the world. Many of my friends wear atheist glasses or agnostic glasses. And it's just important to take the glasses off occasionally and have a look at them rather than simply looking through them. This was a point that C.S. Lewis made long ago. Now, when we find someone with as powerful a mind as Hawking saying there's no God, that has reverberations in society. I wrote my little book because I got a letter from a young man who was driving his car past a petrol station, and there was a big hoarding. Hawking says there's no God, and he nearly lost control of his car. He had to stop. He was only a young chap, not with much formal education, and he said, if Stephen Hawking says there's no God, who am I to say there is? And that so moved me. He was a Christian young man that I thought, I'm going to write something to try to help people navigate this. And so I started to examine Hawking's argument. And I'm going to do a little bit of that with you tonight, because he claims to have reasons why belief in God is, at the very best, unnecessary, although he claims to be, or claimed to be, an atheist. He says this: on the scale of the entire universe, the positive energy of the matter can be balanced by the negative gravitational energy, and so there's no restriction on the creation of whole universes. Now here it comes. Because there is a law like gravity, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Spontaneous creation is the reason there's something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going. Now, when I read that at first, I had to read it again. Because there is a law like gravity, that is because there is something. The universe can and will create itself from nothing. Flat contradiction. And I thought, that can't be. Because neither gravity nor a law of gravity is nothing. And what is Hawking suggesting? Is he suggesting that laws are creative? Notice he doesn't say because gravity exists. He says because there is a law like gravity. I presume he meant that gravity exists because laws cannot create anything. Paul Davies, who's a brilliant writer on these things and not a theist, he similarly says there's no need to invoke anything supernatural in the origins of the universe or of life. I have never liked the idea of divine tinkering. For me, it is much more inspiring to believe that a set of mathematical laws can be so clever as to bring all these things into being. But that's science fiction. A set of mathematical laws bringing something into being. That's what some financiers believed at the time of the financial crash. They thought that you could create money by doing mathematics. Unfortunately, you can't. C.S. Lewis made the point long ago. If you want to get £2, you have to add £1 and £1. You just don't add 1 plus 1. You can do arithmetic from now to eternity, but it won't create anything. And laws don't cause anything. Newton's law of motion never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe. People with cues do that. The laws describe the motion. They don't cause it. And there's such a confusion, but I was amazed to find it in a scientist of this eminence. I just couldn't figure it out. And to go on a little bit, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. What do you make of that? If I say X creates Y, I suppose I mean something like if you've got X, you'll get Y. And if I say X creates X, what does that sound like? Well, it seems to me it implies that nonsense remains nonsense even if scientists write it. Something cannot create itself. That's a meaningless statement. And from nothing. This is a big question. It's a famous philosophical question. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why does the universe exist? Now, I have become extremely interested in nothing. Indeed, I give lectures on nothing these days. And I'm going to talk to you for a few seconds about nothing because it is so interesting. How do you get something from nothing? Remember, this is what Hawking claims to do and so render God unnecessary. You see, as a Christian, I believe the universe came from nothing physical, but it didn't come from nothing. It's the creation of an infinite, eternal God who's non-physical, who is spirit. That's the Christian view. But now, if you don't have that, then the current view of the history of the universe forces you back to when there was absolutely nothing. So how do you get something from nothing? Well, one way of doing it is to redefine nothing. Now, I used to think nothing was a pretty simple concept. It simply meant absence of anything. But now I discover its definition has been changed in clever ways that actually, I believe, deceive people into thinking the problem's solved. When you look elsewhere in Hawking's book, you discover that nothing is a quantum vacuum. That isn't nothing. And I had an opportunity in Harvard, at MIT, the faculty club, the Harvard-MIT faculty club, to have an open discussion with the most famous cosmologist alive today, Alan Guth, the father of the theory of inflation. It was pretty terrifying to have a debate with him. But anyway, he was very friendly, and we had a very interesting time. So I risked asking the first question. I'd never done it in my life before. But I said, Alan, when we'd finished, there's, you know, out there in the public, there's much ado about nothing. People are puzzled, and I want you to answer this question. When you, as a cosmologist, use the word nothing, do you mean it in the same way as all the rest of us mean it? Absence of anything. He said, no, we do not. I said, thank you very much. They have not created something from nothing. Let me read to you another attempt. Just think seriously about what this is saying and what you would say to a 13-year-old who wrote it. Surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. What? Surely nothing is every bit as physical as something, especially if it is to be defined as the absence of something. That was written by Lawrence Krauss, who's world famous as a professor of astrophysics at Arizona State University. It's sheer nonsense. And my concern, ladies and gentlemen, is this. If scientists are reverting to this kind of stuff to get rid of God, then there's something seriously amiss. And people will come back and say, but look, John, Hawking was a genius. Yes, he was a mathematical genius. But Lord Rees, our astronomer royal, said some very interesting things in connection with Stephen Hawking's death. And he said them in public, and I thought it was a very courageous thing to do. He said, I know Stephen very well. And he said, I know he knows little philosophy and almost no theology, and we shouldn't listen to a single word he says on any of these topics. Now, that I say in the context of the death of a genius took some courage. But Lord Rees, who's not a theist, but he felt it was important to redress the balance. You see, the problem is this. Not everything that a scientist says is science. And we need to learn that. And the authority of some of these people is rightly very high. So that when, say, Carl Sagan, at the beginning of his television series, said, "The cosmos is all that is, was, or ever shall be," that's not a statement of science, it's a statement of his atheism. But because he's a famous scientist, people say, marvelous. We need to learn to distinguish the difference between real science spoken by scientists and worldview statements made without any evidence at all. Listen to someone from the other side now. Alan Sandage, who became a Christian in his 50s, regarded as the father of astronomy. "I find it quite improbable that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God, to me, is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something instead of nothing." So far in our quest, we see that history gives a strong indicator that there's a link between at least the rise of modern science and theism. And yet we have strong voices that are atheistic. Why are they so atheistic? And why do they invite us, for instance, to choose between God and science? And I discovered not so long ago that one of the reasons is because they don't understand the concept of God. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, you see, many of my friends who are atheists, they think that the God I believe in is like the Greek god of lightning, who will disappear the moment I do a course on atmospheric physics. A kind of God of the gaps. I can't explain it, therefore God did it. And suddenly it dawned on me, that's why many people, including Hawking, invite us to choose between God and science. They think the God I believe in is a God of the gaps. That is, a God who disappears with scientific advance. Well, of course, logically, if you believe in a God of the gaps, then you have to choose between God and science, because that's the way you have defined God. But you may have noticed, I hope at least some of you have read the first few words of the Bible. In the beginning, God created the bits of the universe we don't yet understand. Not quite, but that's exactly the God of the gaps type of explanation. No, the God of the Bible, he created the heavens and the earth. He's the God who created the whole show, the bits we understand and the bits we don't understand. And in fact, it's the bits we do understand that reveal to us his genius. You see, is God unnecessary? Well, gods of the gaps are completely unnecessary, and science will get rid of them. So we need to be sure what we mean when we're talking about God, the eternal creator and sustainer of the universe. But there's more. There's a problem with the understanding of science. Let me go back briefly to the notion that science is the only way to truth. And let's ask ourselves the question, why is the kettle boiling? Well, because the heat energy from the gas flame is being conducted through the base of the kettle, and that's agitating the molecules of water. That's why it's boiling. Okay? Well, actually, it's boiling because I'd like a cup of tea. Now, you laugh. Let's analyze your laughter. Why do you laugh? Because you can see that those are two explanations that do not conflict. They do not compete. They complement. And they are both valid. They're different kinds of explanation. This is hugely important. If I say science is the only way to truth, then I'll have to say, well, the water isn't boiling because I want a cup of tea. That would be absurd. So let me put this point very carefully. God and science do not compete as explanations because they are different kinds of explanation. Any more than Henry Ford competes with the law of internal combustion as an explanation for the motor car. I sometimes speak in schools and I ask the kids, let me give you two explanations for the motor car. One's engineering, automobile engineering. The other is Henry Ford. Which is the true explanation? And the kids down to the age of 6 will put up their hands and say, but sir, you need both. Why can some of our very bright intellectual voices not see that? You need both. Science helps us understand in part the universe. But why there exists a universe in the first place for science to study, only God makes sense of that. We need both, and the one doesn't exclude the other. There's a scientific explanation, and there is an explanation in terms of personal agency. But there's more. Explanation is a very important concept, and I wish I had more time to talk to you about it, but then I've written a few things about it that I hope people will find helpful. Because there is a view that's very deeply held in many quarters that explanation always proceeds from the simple to the complex. You explain a complex thing in simple terms. Well, it's wonderful if you can do that, but it doesn't always work. And the place that it doesn't work is where language is involved. Richard Dawkins argues this in his book. He says that a designer God cannot be used to explain organized complexity, because any God capable of designing anything would have to be complex enough to demand the same kind of explanation in his own right. That sounds very impressive until you apply it to Richard Dawkins and his book. I pick up his book, it's complex, 400 pages or so, so I try to find out the origin of this book. And somebody says, well, it originated in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins. Well, I said, that can't be so, because Dawkins himself says the explanation cannot be more complex than the thing you're explaining. Do you see that? It falls because wherever we see language, we argue upwards. Now, I can see the word exit somewhere here. Just 4 letters. The moment you see it, you know there's a mind behind it, don't you? Very simple, 4 letters. And yet you postulate a mind. And that seems to me to be a very powerful argument. The late Antony Flew, philosopher, lifelong atheist, said research into DNA had shown by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved. Now, it's not just the complexity of DNA, it's the fact that it's language-like. We see the word exit, 4 letters, and we postulate a mind. We see 3.5 billion chemical letters in the right order in DNA, and what do we say? Well, most people say chance and the laws of nature. There's something curious going on here, and I want to probe into it, because you see, that fits much better with the biblical view. In the beginning was the Word. All things were made by him. Do you notice how different that is from the naturalistic view? Because the naturalistic view is, in the beginning was nothing, and nothing turned into everything. In the beginning was the Word. This is a word-based universe, and every cell of your body demonstrates it. And the fact that we can describe the universe by mathematics is another evidence that we live in a word-based universe. And one of my biggest problems, ladies and gentlemen, is that we've asked the question to start tonight, can God and science coexist? I think they can very well. My main problem is that atheism and science are very complex and difficult bedfellows. I don't think atheism and science coexist very well at all. Let me give you a little kind of story to illustrate that, because sometimes I chat to my colleagues, scientists, and I say to them, what do you do science with? They say and they're about to say mind when they realize that nowadays it's not politically correct to believe in the mind, so they do it with their brain. So I say, okay, fine, I believe the mind and brain are separate, but there's a different story. Tell me about the brain, a brief history of the brain. And I usually get something like this. The brain is the end product of a mindless, unguided process. And I look at them and I say to them, and you trust it? Now tell me honestly, tried this out on many people, tell me honestly, if you knew that your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, would you trust it? And I always wait for an answer. And I've always got the answer, no. It's fascinating. And you see, they often look at me and say, where did you get that argument from? Because they see I'm not clever enough to think of things like that. So I said, actually, you'll never believe where I got it. Oh, yes, we will. No, you won't. I got it from Charles Darwin. What? Charles Darwin wrote this, but then with me. The horrid doubt always arises whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? Now, this is fascinating because C.S. Lewis pointed it up long ago. Unless human reasoning is valid, no science can be true. But this explanation of the origin of the brain is undermining the very reasoning process. And it's not only Christians that point it out. This is Thomas Nagel, who wrote one of the most mind-blowing book titles in recent years. His book is called Mind and Cosmos: Why the Neo-Darwinian View of the World is Almost Certainly False. Now, Nagel's an atheist and a brilliant philosopher. Here's what he says. If the mental is not itself merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. One of my major reasons for rejecting atheism is not because I'm a Christian at all. It's because I'm a scientist. You see, Christianity gives me a rational justification for trusting my mind to a certain extent as accessing the universe. This kind of logical consequence of atheism removes that. But our title tonight was not just science and God, it was science and Christianity. And here's where the rub comes. And I'm nearly done because I just want to point out one thing. Many people say to me, but look, okay, maybe there is evidence for God around the place, but you're a Christian. And surely you realize that the very central claims that Christ made are untenable in a scientific age. Because the central fact that you claim to believe is that Jesus rose physically from the dead. But that's absurd. Ever since David Hume, we realize that miracles are violations of the laws of nature, and they simply can't happen, so your Christianity disappears. And that is an argument that's used by many of my colleagues to just dismiss the whole thing. They say, okay, it's interesting looking at the universe and mathematics and the various evidences but the whole thing collapses when you look at the claim for the supernatural. Now, I want to suggest to you as I close that David Hume was completely wrong. And Lewis illustrated it brilliantly. I'm staying in a hotel tonight, very comfortable in Birmingham. Now, let's just imagine I'm staying for a few days. And on the first evening, I put £100 in the drawer beside my bed. And in the second evening, I put another £100. So that's 100 plus 100 is 200. On the third morning, I wake up, open my drawer, and I find £50. What do I conclude? Do I conclude, A, that the laws of arithmetic have been broken, or that the laws of England have been broken? I'm glad you're laughing, because you see where the confusion is. The laws of nature are not like the laws of a country. They're not constraints. Now let's proceed to examine my little story a bit further. How do I know that the laws of England have been broken? Because I know that the laws of arithmetic have not been broken. Do you see that? It's the knowledge of the laws of arithmetic, that 1 + 1 = 2, that tells me that I made a mistake. What was my mistake? I thought that the drawer was a closed system of cause and effect. Just raise that up and amplify it to the level of the universe. You see, naturalism, atheistic naturalism, teaches us that the universe is closed, a closed system of cause and effect. But what I'm claiming is that it isn't. It's an open system created by a creator who can, of course, feed new events into the system. They don't break any laws. You see, if I claimed as a Christian that Christ rose from the dead by natural mechanisms operating in the grave 5 minutes before it happened, then it could be seen to break the laws. But the Christian claim is not that, ladies and gentlemen. It's that Christ was raised from the dead by an input of colossal power from outside the system. Science cannot say that cannot happen. Science can observe graves and say resurrections are very improbable, but it cannot say they're impossible. And we can then turn around, once we realize that David Hume was simply wrong in saying miracles violate the laws of nature, we are then free to investigate rationally as to whether the resurrection of Jesus Christ actually occurred as a matter of history. And we can investigate that. I'd love to have time to investigate it with you, but perhaps some of you may be persuaded to look at my new book, which comes out on the 1st of January. Can Science Explain Everything? Forgive the shameless advertising, but some of you might like a simpler approach to this question. So I'm a Christian and not simply a theist, because I believe the evidence shows objectively and historically that Jesus rose from the dead. But I'm also a Christian because there is subjective evidence. Christ makes certain claims. And I have tested those claims. And we may come to discuss them later. But I've said enough. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.